The Atheist Debates Project presents Dealing with Debate Topics. So, I know a lot of you are probably never going to engage in a formal debate where you have to worry about topics, but there are thoughts that I have about picking those topics if you are going to do public debates that might relate to other conversations and give you a look into how I analyze a topic, figure out whether or not it's a good topic, whether or not there's a better way to reword it. Because even in individual conversations, the subject that you're talking about could be viewed in many different ways in your head and in somebody else's head. And so figuring out how to ask a better question or how to state a better resolution for a formal debate can certainly help you in the informal debates. And to do that, we're going to take a look at a debate topic that a friend of mine recently did, which is, do we need God to make sense of life? So the first thing to notice is that this debate topic is a question. That happens quite frequently. In a lot of different, there's a bunch of different debate formats, and any of you who have taken a debate course or participated in a debate club or competitions, you'll understand that quite often there's a resolution, resolved, God exists. And then one person is arguing in favor of the resolution, or one team is arguing in favor of it, and one is arguing against it. Essentially, God does not exist. Questions are a little problematic because what ends up happening in some people's head is if we say the subject of this debate is, does God exist? They presume that one person is coming in to argue, yes, God exists, and the other one is coming in to argue, no, God does not exist. Except that doesn't have to be the case. And if you've watched my debates, which hopefully you have since you're here for this, you'll find that quite often my response is not to take the no, God does not exist, because that may be something that you cannot demonstrate. It'd be just as flawed for me to defend a proposition I couldn't actually defend as it would be for me to try to defend my opponent's proposition. You have to determine where you're going to assign the burden of proof. We've done videos on that. I want to focus on this topic because I think that there's a topic hidden in this that could be a really good discussion, but the topic as worded is incredibly flawed. So, do we need God to make sense of life? Now, first of all, my friends who are into grammar are going to realize right off the bat that that's ambiguous and in more ways than one. Because what does that question mean? Does that mean we are incapable of making sense of life, but God will make sense of life for us? So, do we need God to make sense of life for us? Then another version is, do we need for there to be a God in order for life to be sensible? And in other words, if there is no God, then life can't make any sense. Nothing is coherent or cogent. There's another version, which is, do we need to believe that there's a God, irrespective of whether or not a God actually exists, in order to be able to make sense of life? The other problems with the topic are that it's about making sense of life. Well, what does that mean? I've talked before about how you want to try to make sure that you define your terms ahead of time. If you are going to have a debate and a debate topic's been presented, I've been presented with loads of bad debate topics, and I've done videos on those as well. But okay, so let's say we've decided that what we're really asking is it necessary that a God exist in order for the facts about life to be sensible? But you still got the problem of this word life. Are we talking about biology? Are we talking about reality? And to me, my immediate suspicion upon hearing the debate topic is that what they wanted to discuss is whether or not we can make sense of the facts of reality, even if there is no God. That's a much better debate topic. There's probably loads of ways to word it that are even better than that. When I sit down and somebody presents me with a few debate topics that we can potentially address, I'm very particular, and I will go word by word through there to make sure that we're trying to not be as ambiguous as this sentence is, and to pick out every single word where there may be a potential disagreement on what we mean by it or how we're using that term. Not to get, Clinton-esque and asking questions about what is, but if you had, or what is means, if you had a debate that was, does God exist? Okay, Well, that's just 3 words. It's a question. What do we mean by God? Which God are we talking about? But we can also look at does. So now we're definitely only talking about present tense. There is some being that we're going to call God who currently exists. But the third word about existence, that's worth defining too. And I remember Tracy Harris pointing this out, that a lot of us just take it for granted. We get a debate topic like, does God exist? We focus on okay, which God are we talking about? And how do we demonstrate that something exists? And for the secularist, the person who's not a believer, who does not accept the God in question, we tend to look at existence within the scope of and limits of reality. Whereas the person we're debating may have a definition or a usage of exists that includes something beyond the reality we experience. Especially if we're talking about something like a God that is supposedly transcends space and time. I don't know of anything that transcends space and time. I don't know how you would demonstrate that it's possible for something to transcend space and time. I don't know how you could demonstrate that there is something that in fact does transcend that. So in this debate that Eric did, do we need a God to make sense of life? Once I figure out what I think we're talking about, and one of the best things you can do is actually have a conversation before the debate with the people who are going to be participating in this debate. Find the person that you're going to be debating and say, look, can we clear up some terms? I've had debate opponents who were willing to send me their entire opening statement ahead of time. I don't normally do that, but that's mostly because I don't write out a word-for-word opening statement. I tend to almost never be fully scripted. Even for these videos, what I have is basically a rough outline of the points that I want to address. And then I will go over those points many times in my head over a period of a week or two, so that it's a lot more conversational, so that it doesn't feel like it's rehearsed. I'm somebody who's annoyed when someone is reading to me, so I don't like to feel like I'm reading to others. I think it's one of the advantages that I have in debate, where I don't come off as scripted, because I'm not. It's nice that it works out that way, because I feel better doing this. And one of the things is I will drill these things into my head. I will have miniature debates with myself while I'm driving around, discussions with other people, trying to get thoughts from different people to build my understanding. Because if you actually have a good understanding of the subject, you shouldn't have to prepare further for the specifics of the conversation. If somebody walks up to me and says, hey, what do you think about morality? I don't just have a stock sentence or two. I have fairly well-formed thoughts. And one of the key things is that the thoughts that aren't as well-formed are still formulated such that I understand why they're not well-formed. There may be questions that I don't think we have an answer to. So in this debate, if I'd have been presented with, do we need God to make sense of life? I think I would have immediately opted to, after a few moments of thought, change the debate topic to what I believe they were actually asking. Is a God necessary in order for humans to make sense of reality? Because that, I think, is the crux of it. That's where you get into the sort of presuppositional apologetics that without a God to appeal to, you don't have a grounding for logic. You don't have a grounding for rationality. There are other aspects of this where this came up during the debate, where essentially they were talking about morality or a sense of better or a better world, where what you really needed was a good understanding of what we mean by better. And you never know, or you rarely know. In some cases, I know exactly what an opponent's going to walk in saying, because they're predictable and they stay on script. But I don't ever plan for that to go exactly like that. I try to realize that maybe they've learned something between the last debate I watched with them and the present day. And if that's the case, that they've changed their views on things, because my views on things have changed. My views on how we should talk about will and free will have certainly been altered over years, even recently. My thoughts on morality were continually reformed as new questions were presented, and I had to think of things, also based on information I got from other books. Now, this is all about the debate title itself, and I would have revamped it. I would have probably, if they don't allow me or they don't allow you to change the debate topic to something that's more productive, just address it. Just say, look, here, let's go for like 30 seconds, which should be a short enough point to make in any opening. Thank you for having me here tonight. I'm so glad to be here. Do we need God to make sense of life? This question is perhaps ill-formed, and I don't want people to be confused. I'm not talking about whether or not we need to believe in a God in order to understand biology. I'm not talking about the various formats and views that people could have on this topic. For me, this question really translates to, is a God necessary in order for human beings to make sense of reality? And there's still a lot of room in there for us to have conversation, but that's what I'm going to be focusing on this evening. And then during the actual discussion, when people drift off point, as is inevitable, the majority of my debates, no matter what the topic was, eventually kind of devolved into a discussion about morality, because that seems to be one of the biggest sticking points. This notion that, without God, all things are permissible, so we're just going to fall into hedonism. If you're doing a debate on morality, why not have the debate topic be as clear as possible? Is it possible to be good without God? Or better yet, is it possible for humans to behave morally correctly without appealing to a God? And now you're not even having a conversation about whether or not a God exists. Because it could be the case that no God exists, and yet belief in some sort of MacGuffin God that becomes the character driving force of the universe to ground morality could still be the case. Maybe it's the case that human beings are just base and terrible, and if you don't have a God belief, you can't ever be properly good. And we know that that's not the case. We know that there are plenty of people who do plenty of good things without a God belief and with a God belief. We also know that there are people who do terrible things with and without a God belief. And all these are independent from whether or not a God exists. When I'm thinking about the debate and the topic specifically, that's when I'm probably at my most pedantic. I'm going to nitpick that topic apart, not just and never to try to get a technical win, like, I showed up here today prepared to debate whether or not a God was necessary for us to have a grasp and understanding of how reality functions that is well grounded. And unfortunately, my opponent showed up and never actually addressed the topic. They just wanted to talk about morality this and morality that and bah humbug. Technical victory, I win. I'm the only one who showed up and talked about the topic, and I've made my case, and now I win. Yeah, that'll never happen. Because I don't look at debates as a win-lose thing. I'm not in college. I'm not in a debate club. Nobody's out there scoring it. The way I view it, the way I try to address it is, are we having a good conversation? Are people going to learn something out of this? And are we talking about the same thing? And that starts by having a debate topic that you guys are all in agreement on what the subject is, no matter how it's worded. I'm going to touch on a couple other quick things on debate topics. So the last couple of points to address are, I have a friend who is an amazing debater. And there's certain debate topics that he won't touch. He won't address whether or not, like, for example, is Christianity rational? Because in the philosophical world, there's a context in which something is rational if it's internally consistent. And rational does not equate to true. And there's also the philosophical problems of whether or not we have access to truth. Now, my view of truth is that which comports to reality, but I have to also acknowledge that I only have my brain. I have an internal model of reality that is based on experience and evidence, and I'd like for that internal model to match the actual reality as best as it can. But I have no way to demonstrate that there is an actual reality or that my understanding of reality is accurate beyond my beliefs about reality consistently result in me staying alive and me having consistent experiences in reality. Maybe I'm a brain in a vat. I don't know. But when I'm looking at the debate topic, I will debate, is Christianity rational? Because I can start the debate off by saying, now we could be having a conversation about whether or not it's rational in a philosophical sense. Is it internally consistent? But Harry Potter might be internally consistent, or whatever sci-fi fantasy thing you happen to choose could be internally consistent fantasy, and I care more about whether or not it's real. So when I talk about is Christianity rational, I'm talking about is Christianity supported by reasonable arguments and evidence that make it a warranted belief about facts within reality. The big thing is, for those of you who aren't going to ever participate in a public formal debate with a topic, when you're sitting down and engaged with someone and a question comes up or a subject comes up where you're actually debating it, pause and go through the words and see if there's a way that the sentence, the subject, or the question can be reformed such that the two people involved, or the however many people are there, can actually have a much more productive discussion where they're not talking past each other, where one of them thinks, oh, well, by exist, I mean exist within reality only, and the other one thinks exists is in a transcendental state, and you'll never, ever make any headway as long as you're talking about two different things. That brings up my final point on debate topics. Sometimes it doesn't matter what the printed topic of the debate is. I mean, yes, if we had does God exist and we show up and instead we debate a political position that has absolutely nothing, well, then you've done a disservice to everybody who's watching. But when we're dealing with discussions about whether or not a God exists or whether or not God is necessary for the moral grounding or logical grounding, etc., you can have a debate topic that is perhaps poorly worded, corrected on the fly. You can have a debate topic, and you could even show up and say, we meant to have a debate about this, but in the course of the discussion, we found that we were both on the same page right to this point and split. And so now that subject is going to become the thing that we're actually discussing and debating. It's still loosely related to the topic, but at the end of the day, you're not bound by words. And if anybody comes in and has a discussion and says, well, you didn't present your case and therefore I win. Well, congratulate them on their win. It's a Pyrrhic victory at best to try to win a debate on a technicality, and it shows to everybody that this person is not so much interested in getting to the truth. This person is not as much interested in having a conversation that's going to be productive, that might edify the audience. They have a view that this is a WWE event and they're going to come in and smack you around and, oh, I got a victory and, ooh, you didn't address my point. You see it a lot with the Gish Gallop type of oratory, where someone will make more claims than you could possibly address. You do your best to address the ones that you can in the time allowed, and they'll just ignore that. Ignore the fact that you countered or pointed out flaws in their argument, and just go to whatever you didn't address. Well, we never heard my opponent talk about this aspect of morality. He didn't ever give me a definition of what is better or why something is better. And watch for those types of things, both in formal debates and in informal discussions. Because if we're having a conversation about whether or not a particular worldview leads to a better world, we have to be able to talk about what we mean by better. But even if we don't have a clear standard to say, this is the thing by which I'm determining that X is better, you can always ask the question, well, do you agree with me that A is better than B? It doesn't, because if we're in agreement that A is better than B, and you're saying it's better because God wants it, and I'm saying it's better because it results in a world with less suffering or with greater happiness or with cooperation that has a butterfly effect to build a world where we have better health care, where we live longer, where we are generally happier. Any of those could be a standard for better. But even if we don't agree on the standard, if we agree on the goal, we can still have a discussion about potentially how to get there. How do we go about convincing people that A is better than B? Because I think you'll get to the point where if their reason that A is better than B is that God said so, or they think God said so, which is often the more accurate, and perhaps always the more accurate if in fact there's no God, because anything you apply to a God is clearly something you think a God said, and if there's no God ever said it, so it's all coming from you. So when they try to say that, oh, well, without a God, you don't have a standard for A, which is what a lot of debate topics are going to come down to. Does God exist? Well, how would you demonstrate that? One of the ways to show that a God exists is to show that a God must necessarily exist in order for things that we already recognize to be true or agree are true to be true. Last little point. Why are you doing it? If you're coming to a debate and you don't hit the exact topic, but you do hit the periphery, and you're having an open and honest discussion that promotes questions, that gives people information, that promotes people to think about these subjects, and ultimately winds up being a better discussion around the periphery of whatever was labeled, that's probably okay. Because the odds are you're not in a formal, structured debate where it's scored and you will lose points on technicalities. At the end of the day, if the goal isn't to get closer to the truth and have conversations where we are honestly trying to understand another person's position in order to evaluate it for ourselves and for others and to point out why we agree or disagree, then perhaps we're doing debates for the wrong reasons. I like to take the debate titles, put them on a list, and go through them word by word. Figure out, is there a better way to phrase this that will make it easier for us to have a conversation, a more productive conversation? And if I'm not allowed or they don't want to change it, I can do it in the debate. There's nothing dishonest or inaccurate about saying, my understanding of this debate topic is that we're trying to see, hey, do we have a good reason to believe this? Make it as plain and simple so that anybody can understand it. If you dig in and start going down a long, pedantic, overly analytical deconstruction of the topic in front of everybody, it just sounds like you're trying to give a lecture and show how clever you are. And I have zero interest in that. When I'm doing debates, whether it's on the TV show or in front of an audience or even one-on-one with someone, I'm genuinely interested in figuring out how to better have these conversations, how to get people to say, at the end of the day, here's where we depart. And I've had some great debate opponents where we got to the nuts and bolts, the bits and pieces within our epistemology where we just disagree. I think that's going to spawn the next, for lack of a better term, generation of discussions. If one of my debate opponents and I sit down in the future, and we've had several debates, somebody like Blake, I don't think we need to rehash everything. I think we can begin the next conversation that Blake and I have on stage might, or probably should be, about where we differ on epistemology, about what sort of evidence is warranted in order for something to be believable. And the key for me is your model consistent? Are you applying, if you took your model for discerning truth and applied it to other religious claims, would you reach the same conclusion, or would you wind up being in a position where you're forced to believe two contradictory things? Because if you can show that your methodology, your epistemology, your justification for understanding something and believing it's rationally warranted can lead you to two separate conclusions being true when they can't be, that's a flawed epistemology. The key is to define the terms, not feel like you are bound to a specific wording, and focus instead on the idea. Hopefully this will help you both if you're doing a formal debate and in informal discussions. Especially in informal discussions, you can pause at any moment and say, do you mean this? Do you mean that? When you say, we need God to make sense of life, you're not talking about biology, are you? You're basically saying, hey, without a God, I don't know how you could have any foundation for rationality or morality or whatever it is. Ask those questions, you'll end up having better conversations. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.